So, for a number of years now, I've coined the adage that the Canadian charts are always better. Billboard certainly tested that theory in recent years, but right now, I want to expand on the Canadian side of that conversation, because I've seen some folks argue that Canadian culture is having a moment in between heated rivalry and Nirvana the band, the show, the movie, or what Justin Bieber did at Coachella, or the creation of the Toronto Tempo in the WNBA, or the Montreal Canadiens' current Stanley Cup run, to say nothing of that last World Series between the Toronto Blue Jays and the Los Angeles Dodgers, or how the current Prime Minister, Mark Carney, has seemingly revitalized the centrist Liberal Party across Canada with the sort of approval ratings and presentation as a statesman that other politicians worldwide appear to crave. It's not all sunshine and roses. Just with Carney, I've read his book Values, and his technocratic, pragmatic optimism has its sharp limits without a more societal reorganization that I'm not sure he's equipped to broach. I'm perpetually cranky with the Toronto Raptors and their first round exit this year. On that topic, there's a rather large Toronto-based figure who happened to drop 3 albums in one day. We're gonna have to deal with him. And let's not forget a certain AstroTurf separatist movement brewing out west that would seek to cleave our nation apart. But there is a lot of attention on Canada and what we have to offer. But what is that offering? How is it defined? What does it represent? What does it exclude? And in an era infused with nationalistic fervor, how does the art shape the emotional and systemic conversations therein? I set myself a daunting mission here. Try to examine in music what Canada has to offer in 2026. A montage spanning the complicated mosaic of culture and art and genre across provinces nationwide. It's been weeks in the making, feels distinctly imperfect. But if that's not emblematic of the Canadian process, I don't know what is. So welcome to Spectrum Pulse, where we talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and where we attempt to explore Canadian music, what makes us feel, and what it can mean in 2026. Strap in, folks. It's gonna be a journey. So let's start off with an act that probably needs a little bit more of an introduction than Canadians think they do. This is an act that can comfortably fill up big halls or even arenas up here, or are tasked with the Canadian equivalent of the Super Bowl, but might not even be recognized down in the United States. This is where you might get the obligatory mention of, ooh, kind of like the Tragically Hip, they played the Grey Cup, and no, not exactly. Arkells broke out in the late 2000s amidst a swath of other pop rock of that time, but where Marianas Trench, again, obligatory mention, especially from me, they went very theatrical very fast, and Faber Drive Stereos and Headley tried to play the pop rock game into the club boom. The less said about the last of them, the better. Arkells have had considerably more longevity. For one, they managed 2 legit great indie teen rock albums right at the gate with Jackson Square and Michigan Left, before making their pop pivot on that major label. And they just kept churning out projects every couple of years for Canadian alternative and rock radio. Honestly, if you were to ascribe a landfill indie label to any Canadian band, Arkells probably would be at the top of that list. But I hate that label, and it's rather reductive for this band. They've been on a major for 15 years. They largely succeeded in their sphere going pop, even if you could argue they were trend-chasing very specific textures. They've got the feel of the local band that actually made it big and stuck around. Their reference points felt a little more localized and were better for it. They might have a lower ceiling, but a higher floor. They'll nail at least 1 single per album. Their writing and genre experimentation considerably better than you would expect. They're terrific live, and if more rock bands in this lane survived into the Hot 100, we all might be better off. Now, It looks like the commercial gas in the tank may have finally run out. The 2020s haven't exactly been kind to them, but this was getting some of their best reception in about a decade, and on the one hand, I get why. It plays to a very comfortable formula with big hooks, bright keys, clean guitars, the occasional splash of horns, and even fiddle. Some odder melodic textures come courtesy of John Congleton, of all people, producing the project, and collabs with Group Love and Portugal the Man to build more indie cred than I think anyone would demand. I could swear that piano melody on Ride with Group Love is a lift from Paul Simon. It's kind of uncanny. But on the other hand, while there's a very warm and comfortable millennial vibe to the Arkells sound, it's a familiarity that's rather long in the tooth, I can admit that. Playing to compositional formulas without really doing much beyond them, especially with the winsome thoughts on growing older, some very loose late capitalism societal commentary. I miss Jackson Square's razor-type specificity and urgency, both What Good and Money should have had way more teeth, and also a lot of the earnest love songs that helped build a lot of that crossover audience. It's got the feel of an album that's set up for them to tour, considerably more upbeat, but you're not going to get a single surprise if you know the band. That does not mean they're bad. Imagine Barcelona has been pegged as the brassy highlight along with the gentle percussive gallop of Two Hearts, but I really like the soft-focused piano ballad Desire's Got Some Questions, certainly compared to the nervy minor key new wave that feels really incongruous on the final third coming from this group. That's something I will peg to John Congleton. He's certainly had an uneven track record the past couple of years. I'm not sure his murky choices always make the most sense with such an otherwise straightforward band, but Arkells also used to have a deeper sense of place to their music that doesn't quite materialize here, especially with all the American indie collaborators and plethora of references to locations that are outside of Canada. That is not uncommon with a lot of Canadian acts who want to show they can play to that larger market and not just get pigeonholed as big in Canada. I've heard the argument that idiosyncrasies of local references, they don't play well in the globalized streaming economy, which I've never really bought coming from other nations. They seem to get away with it. Yet for Arkells, makes a lot of sense if they want to play stages outside the country, tour in the US. But you do lose something with that, and I think their compositional formula, it was strong enough they didn't have to make that choice. So yeah, Between Us is a good album. I'd call it a modest return to form, but also a case where going broader might dilute some of your homegrown strengths. Not the most promising start, I'll admit, but you know, if we're talking about Canadian independent music that also paints broadly but nails that sense of place, yeah, this has been long in coming. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Broken Social Scene are a semi-supergroup of Canadian musicians who have made some critically adored indie records, specifically in the early 2000s. I would describe them as kind of a fundamental in shaping the indie sound worldwide, that era specifically, even while never quite having hits. More influential among other musicians than more broadly popular, although given their crossover with acts like Metric and Feist and all the other niche, very Canadian acts that they worked with over the decades, it's kind of tough to fully describe how much they meant within their scene pre-social media, especially within Toronto. And full disclosure here, I've only started appreciating Broken Social Scene as I have gotten considerably older. They were just a few years before my time in the 2000s, and even during the mid-2010s when I retrospectively tried getting more into them, they were a bit before my time. I didn't quite get it, and I had to develop the patience to really appreciate their ethereal, damn near post-rock swells, married to more of a grandiose indie rock sound and formula, the latter that would wind up ripped off so very often in the next 15 years, both here and stateside. It's led to me having more of an appreciation for their stranger atmospheric experiments, or when they just double down on a lot of terrific hooks. It's why I'm actually way more forgiving of their critically lambasted, but somewhat commercially successful Forgiveness rock record in 2010, an appreciation some came to have with 2017's comeback record Hug of Thunder. But since then, Broken Social Scene have been doing a lot of the media rounds in order to secure their indie legacy, especially in Canada, especially in Toronto, but also have this second comeback, and on some level, almost as if they never left. The experience of discussing them certainly remains the same for me. I'm not sure why I never circled back to review Hug of Thunder in 2017. I probably should have in that time, but by Remember the Humans, I think I finally get them. Broken Social Scene have always made music that makes more emotional sense than it does in text, especially when they got back their producer, David Newfield, who produced a lot of their early classics and maintains that shambling blur of orchestration, this collaborative jamming and yearning experience where so much of all the mess is just left on the page that you have to have it in yourself to embrace, well, whatever happens, and then hope it makes some sort of sense on the other side, both as musicians and for the listening audience. The band themselves have described the music as more about the person who plays the part than the part they play, and yet where the collective nevertheless forms from some of the scraps, less out of unity, more out of frustrated, desperate shared purpose. It's about seizing the moment when your time is up, set up from the horn-driven opening on Not Around Anymore, and then acknowledging when it's time to go, or whenever it's very much not going to work in a relationship, even if you can't fully understand it, like on The Briefest Kiss, where the impending mess is always in the cards whenever you reach for that greatest height. It sets up the stakes, which is why the stretch to find a very flawed love, or at least very human connection, even amidst every obstacle, internal, external, feels like the constant through line of Broken Social Scene. It's what makes them so resonant. There is a human romance to that sentiment, even one that underscores why they have provided the soundtrack to so many montages, if not romantic, then leaning in that direction, and why cuts like And I Think of You, then trying to explore something more thorny and complicated, someone they knew who was trying to commit suicide, take their own way out. It's a bit of a distinctly weird note on this album. Granted, some of that might be that windswept, meandering melancholy that reminds me way too much of Destroyer, that also saturates much of this album's midsection. It is pretty effective in creating that post-rock atmosphere, but the textures don't always grab me as starkly, and again, that's pretty common with Broken Social Scene their entire career. But you know, thinking more broadly towards the band at their best, what they mean, something that gets missed when discussing the strength of multiculturalism in Canada is that it is not the American melting pot you learn in social studies, where everyone comes in and then comes out American, all seeking that larger American dream. But in Canada, it's more a mosaic. Composite pieces, where disparate and occasionally fractured and contrasting ideas come together to form a more striking national identity and what it can mean to be Canadian, added national pride or otherwise. And when Broken Social Scene described a lot of their artistic process, I couldn't help but think that it feels like the metatextual apotheosis of that idea, form and function merged together. In the interview they did with Under the Radar for this album, they highlighted how it never made for a lot of easy dealings with major record labels that really wanted to sign them, especially as it would pit members against each other, all who had their own projects, which, if you remember their commercial peak, that was starting to creep to the forefront, and it highlights how whatever dream they chase cannot be so easily quantified. So Remember the Humans acts in both question and mission statement in that regard, feeling ever so precarious as they get older. another. I'm not going to claim it's their best by any means. By necessity, the assembly of these projects seems built on fragmentation and a little prayer, where enough of the vibes and the hooks coalesce on cuts like Only Good I Keep or The Call, especially Relief, where the drums are just incredible, or that slow build choral crescendo on Hey Amanda, and with a really nice closer on Parking Lot Dreams. But throughout their entire career, all of it coming together has always felt so hit and miss, and yet the best moments are unlike any other, and this is no exception, even despite everyone who has ripped them off. But even if it's sparing, there's a part of me that ineffably gets what broken social scene does, in the same way I love an electronic act like The Avalanches. There's that similar collaborative spirit that comes through, speaking to the human experience in ways that are not easily defined. Absolutely shaggy, piecemeal around the edges, but on some level, you wouldn't have it any other way. The album's pretty damn good, too.
Yeah, I'm the truth, undisputed and in the booth. Voodoo over loops, acne made my soup. Warwick saying no truce, what you wanna do? Talking big on what you do, you ain't got no proof. When I ball, ain't no hoops.
I think that Canadian hip-hop tends not to get the flowers that it deserves. We'll deal with one of the big reasons why in a bit. So this Cadence Weapon album was absolutely on my docket after the underrated dissection of the modern internet landscape on Roller Coaster in 2024. Hell, I was curious if he was looking to go back to a more textured, old-school sound in comparison with the colder, glitchier electronic production he's utilized for the past couple of projects. The lead-off single I reviewed on my Instagram and TikTok seemed to imply that was happening, and for the most part, he does. This is a swerve. The most obvious comparison point is the tone of some constructed yet slightly askew old school hip-hop elegance that Cadence Weapon touched near the beginning of his career in the 2000s. I don't love Junior T's production for the odd spongy quality of some of the synths and drums, but it certainly constructs that rich live atmosphere around Cadence Weapon's flexing and loose humor that feels a lot less online than his past couple of projects, and more global too. A comparison that sprung to mind in that bragging was Tyler the Creator on Call Me If You Get Lost, or a little Rock Marciano on this year's 656, in the references to thrifted clothing, fashion, international brands, travel, where the price tags might be steep, but you have to search for that quality. But Cadence Weapon is also smart enough to ground this material in some distinctly Canadian reference points, utilizing a more cosmopolitan outlook to better his home, family, and community. It is bragging, but bragging better on songs like Alpenflage or 501XX. And this got me pondering what it means to be Canadian on the world stage, not just in proximity to the United States and being defined as not them, something that our current government is actually trying to pursue with slow but some promising results. I'll freely admit that when there were hints that Canada was curious about greater ties with the European Union or China as a middle power, where it requires we make the best of what we have and we can still enjoy and share the fruits of what the world has to offer, a little bit more movement for a sustainable future as global citizens. Man, it might be a little too earnest, but that's a great dream. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. But Cadence Weapon also juxtaposes his bragging with a societal lens that shows scarcity and the difficulty in maintaining such a flex. And outside of the art, it can be a struggle to translate that message, often through systemic factors exacerbated by late capitalism, amplified down south but certainly embraced up here, and those locally who would rather only support a voice that tells them what they want to hear, doesn't challenge them, that doesn't want to feel excluded by more complex art. Even if I would argue Cadence Weapon's accessibility as a wordsmith and MC and his willingness to write hooks is one of his biggest assets. He doesn't get enough credit for it. What feels resonant about Forager is actually putting in the work, and yet not quite being able to relax knowing there's more to be done, especially as a new father who wants to bend the system to be more equitable for everyone in the future and allow good taste for a demarcation of unique value. And you know, while we're in the territory of black music that encourages some of that confrontation and challenge,
Fire, rain down on me.
So I actually skipped over covering this album earlier in the year, mostly because I wasn't sure I had anything left to say. Dominique Fils-Aime hails from Montreal. I've been reviewing her since 2019, and I tend to find a lot to like with her very quiet reserve, her professional traditionalism, her knack for blending in old school R&B with jazz, soul, blues, and more recently touches of folk and new age music, which left her last album feeling more introspectively meditative than stirring. If I'm being blunt, while I can appreciate the organic percussion texture and the subtle vocal harmonies of those more gentle moments, especially the languid sprawl of the late album Rhythm of Nature, that is probably the best of them. It took until the tabla tempo picked up and the strings playing across the minor chords halfway through Sunskin to feel some of that internal journey towards enlightenment bend into darker, more groovy, and more interesting territory, like at the piano's cascade and the trumpet just goes off through Freedom Become. In particular, the spare jazzy embellishments, they're finally back in earnest from 2019's excellent Stay Tuned, with Fils-Aime being that source of soulful, stabilizing gravity as the keys and the bass, the horns and the strings sinuously uncurl. So while I'm still a little bit less engaged with the cyclical and now very familiar mantras in the lyrics, which leads to the momentum feeling again kind of uneven, not quite the level of her best, I know the communal healing still possesses some tangible aura and value, and who am I to dictate how that community finds their revolution or peace, which she puts directly at the forefront on the bluesy smolder and the easy highlight of Life Remains. And what makes Dominique Fils-Aime's music so striking is that while her quieter introspection and confidence might not draw the most attention on a shallow listen or seem more reserved and traditional within community, it is strong enough to glow as part of that mosaic, distinct in its own right. For as much as water is evoked, there's fire as well, fluid to survive but crackling below the surface, a creative flow state able to hold her own, ride the waves, bring forth a heat. If My World is the Sun makes me feel something about Canadian music, it's that this coiled tension, the potential energy can become kinetic in its own space, hold a balance of contradictions in its hands for something that feels ineffably Canadian, even if some might not want to acknowledge it. She literally covers Francis Cabrel for a gorgeous version of Je t'aimais, Je t'aime, Je t'aimerai. And yet, despite it all, as working artist, despite wins at the Junos, the Canadian equivalent of the Grammys, Dominique Fils-Aime is still left with very real material concerns and hoping others can catch that same energy as she keeps working on her music and working on herself, as the spare acoustic single Going Home seems to touch on directly. Hell, that's even true for me in trying to paint an intellectual quantification on all of this. As Life Remains states bluntly, smiling as you lecture me about my own revolution, as you're intellectualizing the music of the soul. It circles back to that same mantra, my life remains the same. I mean, I can take that note. But if I'm speaking of the Junos, and while I'm in the process of potentially making some of my audience uncomfortable,
I was a storyteller. I was a story. I was the son of a good Squamish man.
So here's where I ran into a snag when talking about Canadian music. If I wanted to do this right, I knew I had to consider Indigenous art, made by the folks that were here first and who tend to be overshadowed by many, especially in conversations about the arts. And to their mixed credit, the Canadian music industry has attempted to elevate more Indigenous acts, more through awards like the Junos than through mainstream Canadian commercial channels, where there are up-and-coming and veteran acts who nimbly walk the balance between maintaining deeper cultural ties and a sound that could be accessible to a non-Indigenous population, or let's be honest, a white population. And there are projects I could elevate from that list of the Juno nominees and winners in early 2026, but those are albums from 2025, and I wanted to find Indigenous music released this year that had received some critical attention, which really exposed just how limited or perfunctory that sort of promotion is outside of the Juno Award season. That feels depressing, yet entirely unsurprising. So I did the next best thing. I went Bandcamp diving and found this short indie folk debut from a Squamish person with some mixed German and Chilean ancestry, with the most attention being linked to poetry. And you know what a pleasant surprise this was. Burnished and warm with some really nice fiddle accents, a professional recording but still with some of those textured eccentricities and the touches of synth and vocal processing that you tend to find in the weirdest niches of Bandcamp. I'm tacking some of this up to Emily Millard's production. She's a very respectable Canadian folk pop artist in her own right. She gave a hand here, and all of which are a perfect accent to Silva's sweetly lilting girlish delivery, which feels even more ethereal with the slight overdubs. This is an album that also confronts complex questions of personal identity and heritage head on. It's homespun but subtly ambitious in its scope and some of the more challenging questions it wants to explore. The first song, Natural Blonde, confronts the idealization and colonization of Western beauty standards and how they interweave with very specific feminine signifiers. And from there, you get the tangled and thorny web of questions that packs a lot into these 8 short songs. Storyteller is another highlight for how it paints generations of family trauma from Indigenous men abused by the system while the girls are sent out to schools, men then absent from the lives of their daughters later on, and the desperate desire to both preserve tradition and learn to forgive broken or complicated men. And the final lines referencing the good old hockey game after the faint cushion of ghostly whispers, which on the following cut, Moths, highlights the role women play in maintaining that Indigenous storytelling heritage. It makes a very pointed how Canadians can't well look away even as stories continue on, more complicated than the big Canadian heritage moment that some might want it to be. But what's fascinating in the final third is how songs like Shape of You and Sybil make very deliberate Western reference points. A departed maternal figure building a home while reading Nietzsche, a paternal figure who leaves behind Kafka and Anna Karenina and a haphazard memories of Europe, a penchant for psychoanalysis of the unconscious driven from Freud, and by extension how that must shape the stories and art in their wake. What gives Inheritance songs its potency is openly unpacking and living with that complexity existing between multiple worlds, where there's no easy answer in accepting one side over the other, the value of that history but also its weight. It absolutely has the feel of being a very youthful album. Certain word choices and chord progressions feel a shade clunky. There's definitely room for growth. I did really enjoy finding this, but it posed a complicated question. I'm probably the first person to give this something close to a long-form review in Canada or otherwise. At time of writing on Bandcamp, nobody has publicly bought this album on that platform. And when it's pretty great, and I reflect on the work I had to do to find it, which wasn't nothing but not especially difficult either, it's hard not to reflect on what that struggle a lot of Canadian acts have, even independent ones, Indigenous or otherwise. Yeah, there are funds and grants that can help Canadian musicians write and record music, and there have been real success stories from it. There's literally a fund cited in the credits on Bandcamp for this album, and Canada has its CANCON requirements that specify a certain amount of broadcast content has to be Canadian, which has prompted all manner of frustrating discourse about eligibility, how much Canadian participation matters behind the scenes in writing, production, performance, etc. But the messier conversation kind of needs to be about distribution, keeping up with the digital landscape where laws have not. In late January of this year, writing for the Canadian Industry Trade Broadcast Dialogue, James Wallace highlighted that the Canadian government would be better suited to regulation of distribution in digital spaces. The streaming companies, the algorithms, the actual pipes of discovery, where transparency and accountability should be maintained. Now, that would require the Canadian government or the CRTC to draft and enforce controls on tech giants in which they've proven willing to do in the past, ensuring that Canadian art and culture and news gets properly surfaced. See that whole news crackdown they pushed on Meta back in 2023. And indeed, as of literally May 21st, 2026, while in the process of making this, the Canadian Radio Telecommunications Commission, the CRTC, released new regulatory guidelines in the audiovisual sector, requiring substantially advanced expenditure specifically for the largest video streamers to buy into enhanced partnerships beyond their existing licensing of Canadian content, including substantial investment into French language programming, as well as providing additional discoverability and metadata obligations on the streamers. So I've read both the policy guidelines and some of the commentary from Michael Geist, a Canadian academic in this space who I would describe as a pretty well-recognized authority on modern tech copyright, net neutrality, where I do find substantial agreement around tech freedom, copyright regulation, especially spyware, although probably for different reasons. But also, I would describe my disagreements with him in politics and economics as cordial, but pretty complex. Mostly because of his somewhat techno-libertarian approach to policy that prioritizes consumer choice above all else. In some cases, feels kind of naive, and in others defeatist or deferential to actors who are not known to act in good faith, a view of web platforms that seems either behind the times or completely unwilling to have them face tangible consequences. Specifically, what I take most issue is his critique of discoverability and the metadata obligations, which he theorizes that discoverability already takes a significant component of a streamer's budget, and that redirecting those funds would potentially compromise the development and production budgets of Canadian projects, move money from one place to deprive the others. With respect, I think this is a poor argument for the following grounds. A, I don't see the added expenditure of ensuring proper metadata for Canadian content. That should be the baseline of any and all content a streamer distributes. I mean, the predominant interest in eyeballs and ear holes on the platform, that would be in their best interest to drive that metadata and make sure it's accurate. B, if we accept the premise that existing Canadian content already licensed could make use of that discovery, and we have multiple proven examples of that happening, it also operates in their best interest to drive traffic to see more of the good stuff show up. C, these companies already have a proven record of putting their hand on the scales to double down on their wins, regardless of what the consumer is presumed to want, and what Geist seems to think that they already do naturally, arguing that streamers will be expected to make Canadian and Indigenous content visible to audiences who are not searching for it. It feels flimsy when streamers are already proven to exercise algorithmic control already. And D, most importantly, if we acknowledge that these tech giants, they're hostile to this, they're gonna act in bad faith, they've been proven to do so, especially in the age of generative AI, it's not in the interest of lawmakers to ensure that these corporations' profitability at the expense of Canadian content creators who are operating on the compounding, fundamentally unequal playing field that's been exported upon them. When so much of modern tech and industry is otherwise subsidized out of the States, it is patently disingenuous to say that this is operating under fair market fundamentals, especially with multinational corporations who have no cause or stakes in the best interests of Canadian artists or consumers. Ignoring Canada's right to regulate such bodies in our own borders, that's tantamount to surrendering sovereignty. That being said, and putting aside many a digression I might make on Geist's other op-eds he's written the past couple of years, he is correct that many of the tech giants in the United States government have proven very hostile to that sort of regulation and control, though I do find his assertions of a tech exodus to be a little dubious, both in Canada and worldwide, and it would require leadership willing to wield the big stick. And it seems like the current Prime Minister and Culture Minister, Mark Miller, are kind of hedging their bets at the moment, more interested in placating the platforms as a middle ground than pushing a real enforcement mechanism. It's also relevant to mention that this appears to be specific to audio-visual streamers and not the Spotify, Apple Music, Tidal, YouTube of the world. Although that is probably coming down the pipe, it would be very interesting, especially as that's even more the Wild West and where they and the music industry will likely be even more hostile. Either way, any sort of controls would take a lot of time to implement anyway. Thus, Canadian acts With a lot of talent, they're stuck swimming uphill against larger markets, unless virality happens to fall in their favor. Yeah, I get the impression that some of you rate your music rock nerds are waiting for me to talk about this semi-anonymous prog-adjacent math rock duo. They are not from Montreal, I should add. They're from the small town of Saguenay in Quebec, with a very distinct, abstract, polka-dotted look as they bring forth a lot of sharp, angular, interweaving riffs, with a distinctly satisfying guitar tuning and increasingly staccato rhythm section. They seem a lot more groovy and peculiar than what you would expect for this brand of math rock that can't help but remind me a little bit of King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard's throwback textures and some of their zany microtonal experiments. Perhaps it gives them the leg up from being just pure novelty to me, alongside some really goddamn solid playing in comparison with the prog that embraces a lot of weirdness just for its own sake. And what makes this even more difficult is that they're near purely an instrumental act. Whenever you get vocals at all, they're these braying squawks that barely even form words. You're not getting much in the way of deeper thematic analysis or excavation beyond a lot of comparisons to the other slightly backwards looking art and math rock weirdos who went into a lot of distinct spaces and then try to play their way into interesting niches. For what they make me feel as Canadian, it would be exceedingly easy for me to just throw up my hands and say, it's French weird shit, you just get some of that up here. But I honestly think there might be something more to that, because I often find that Canadian humor tends to fall between the exceedingly dry British schools, bitingly sarcastic, often intensely stratified by class, but structurally enforced by a demarcated path for comics to build their audience, but also the more earnestly goofy but occasionally cruel American comedy linked to many a comic underdog, which up here, combining them together, leads to a certain deadpan, absurd surrealism, especially when you factor in that small town French sensibility, very different from the more chic Montreal scene. And particularly in the 90s, both in and out of music, the distinct bent of Canadian weird, surreal silliness that's less obtrusive, more just this quiet, odd reality, alongside a more dry accessibility that's got more heart than it probably should. It's got a bit of a unique flavor. That's your Corner Gas, your Red Green, your Letterkenny and Shoresy, your Royal Canadian Air Farce, your Schitt's Creek, your Bare Naked Ladies, and oh, speak of the devil, your Nirvana the band, the show, the movie. I think on some level, Angine de Poitrine fits near this territory. They have to know the outfits and the custom instruments kind of look goofy, where the more you hear of them, the more questions you're left asking. Their name translates closest to pectoral angina. That's chest pain from your heart getting enough oxygenated blood. And if they inspire any distinctly Canadian feeling, maybe it's that you probably won't get the full story. They're certainly not going to provide or tell it, even if you know that it's something special, but you're going to get just enough, and it might make you chuckle, something that gets the people going. Maybe get in on the joke, and deep down you know that's probably enough. Or, you know, it could all just be complete nonsense, the French weird shit. You'll get the picture. Yeah, we're staying in Quebec with this one, going into the frigid, depressive, suicidal black metal with decades-long links to a number of critically acclaimed acts in this scene, specifically Gris with 2 albums in the late 2000s and early 2010s. And Miserere Luminis has its roots in the late 2000s as well, but in 2023 surged back with the thunderous Orderly. This album was actually proposed as the sequel to that previous project, we will come back to that, and the buzz was suggesting it was even doing better, maintaining their progressive compositional foundations with even more of an atmospheric bent. And yeah, I'm thrilled to agree with this assessment, as this is one of the most thunderously dark but strikingly gorgeous black metal albums I have heard in some time, making full use of the binaural pickups to make the audience feel so surrounded and engulfed by the keening yet aching strings and the galloping tremolo riffs, the sinuous bass lines and the guttural roars. And when you factor in the simply gorgeous lead guitar work, it creates the feel of being caught up in a maelstrom where you want to take cover but you can't help but marvel at this primal beauty around you, the lightning crashing with every effortless transition feeling like a new front that is scything through the storm. That makes all the more sense when you consider the lyrics that were translated from Quebecois French and the thematic through line. If Orderly it was focusing on the struggle, an ordeal, so to speak, this is the transformation in the face of it. Wrenched to the brink and then trying to find a way back in the face of a world that feels uncaring, the lies that you've told yourself, systems that have exploited or weakened you. And there is something distinctly communal about their promise to provide voice and attempt to shoulder some of your pain, channel the catharsis, help you embrace your most hated flaws, love you regardless, even if said love can be wounded and brutal and flawed in its own right. Where to create the face of it all, there is this act of enraged, righteous defiance, and where from there are passages that feel more free-form and jazz-inspired that feels almost too obvious in the metatext. The band has also pushed back on the term of depressive, suicidal black metal with their recent two albums, and I would agree with this. Not only has the production become way more refined and progressive and cacophonous along the way, the arc here is not to wallow or get lost within the nightmare, but attempt to erupt through it. Be stronger, be better despite all the odds around you. Now, this would be where I would describe what this means within the context of Canadian music. And while there is the easy cliche of, well, northern countries make metal that sounds like the harshness of their colder weather, look at Scandinavia. And you could argue there's a similar chill beauty to a band that matches what you'd hear in an act like Unrequited in Ontario. I'm sorry, that feels too easy to me, especially in a year where acts like Panopticon, Cathedra, and Pure Wrath have made metal projects, black metal projects that feel so sonically emblematic of their home regions of Appalachia, Brazil, and Indonesia respectively. But then I realized with some deeper research that Canadian black metal, especially in Quebec, has decades of real tradition, with Miserere Luminis in direct continuity in that tradition from Greece. It is niche and localized, and they in particular never quite embrace some of that same Quebecois nationalism of some of their peers, but even the fact that it is all in distinctly Canadian French, it's acutely relevant to that Canadian experience, where if you wanted to extrapolate, you could argue the internalized arc of self-actualization in the face of oppression can parallel how Quebec and the French language was marginalized outside of a few provinces. Is that a reach for this band's past two albums compared to the existentialist arc? Yeah, probably. But if I'm going to make a shallow argument that the weather and environment influence your art, that political climate and how it wears on the people and its psyche is just as relevant. Now, the history of Quebecois nationalism and separatism is centuries long, and this is not the frame, nor am I, the guy who grew up in Manitoba and now lives in Toronto, the best person to examine it, especially given certain referendums in Alberta being spurned on for considerably less credible and stupider reasons. But part of Canada's attempt at mosaic multiculturalism is to include the fracture, the conflict, to surface that identity is fundamental to Canada's heritage regardless, a composite piece of the whole, and then be willing to accept the hurricane of jagged, uncomfortable emotions and unhealed wounds that need redress and reconciliation, especially when it comes to some of the most strikingly gorgeous music I've heard all year, probably one of the best albums of 2026. But I mean, if you don't have that sort of reconciliation, learn to salve your wounds and grow, you might become something altogether darker.
Yeah. Your waist so nice to grip, didn't cost a grip. Natural on the hips, waiting for a hint. Stare into your eyes, lost in abyss. Didn't say your name, should I call you miss? Should I call you twist? Should I call you twin? Put your number in, I'll call you soon. Take you on a jet, there's plenty room.
Full disclosure, I was preparing to make this regardless of whatever Drake put out on ICEMAN. But we gotta build to that. We're not starting there. I'm not particularly in the mood to let Drake try to control any narrative in his genre-bending triple dump that's gonna make dealing with the Billboard Hot 100 utter misery for a couple weeks on my side channel. So let's start at the absolute bottom with what many have called perhaps Drake's worst album to date. Given the low bar set by Her Loss, I was skeptical of that. But here, well, perhaps not Drake's most appalling album, but maybe it's his least album. And even then, when Dark Lane demo tapes exist, there's still some competition. Now again, I've been writing reviews of Drake albums since 2013, over a decade, and given the damn near career retrospective I already made for Some Sexy Songs for You with Party Next Door last year, I don't want to waste your valuable time. I actually respect you. So I'm going to seek to answer a couple of questions in these Drake segments. The first being what these even are and if they're any good. The answer, kind of easy. It's the R&B segment of his releases, and by that I mean down-tempo, dreary, etched with too many creakingly ugly chiptune samples and beat switches that feel like a more fragmented version of the back half of Scorpion, minus any feature that could make his increasingly miserable concern trolling worth a damn, including creeping on some specific women that should absolutely get him seen by someone. A lot of those women have partners. You should knock that off. It features Sexy Red at her absolute worst because she sounds like she doesn't remotely care to even be that salacious, which again has me wondering what that back-end gamma connection might mean for Drake, why she keeps showing up. Low Shimmy sounding nasal as all hell, Kendressa sounding outright off-key against the minimalist patter, all amid songs that might be compelling if they could remotely sustain any sort of mood. That's the crippling blow to HABIBTI, because on its marginally better back half, there are some pensive, lonely musings that make good use of negative space. This is what he knows, where Drake proves more adept than anyone should be in documenting the dating hellscape of specific downtown Toronto neighborhoods, with the women who have learned all of his tricks by now and yet still play the sad game, a game where he's not happy to participate, supposedly, but winds up still playing with every ugly sentiment and exacting detail bleeding through. I mean, I know those neighborhoods, I used to live there. It feels regional in the worst way possible, and their lines about wanting to leave Canada for better things, I mean, the trips keep getting longer, juxtaposed to when Drake himself goes on tour in rural America and feels all the more lonely in that heartbreak and existential emptiness. That could be pretty striking. It speaks to a certain underlying insecurity within Toronto that can only dare to support the winning side unless, or until, they succumb to the familiar loser that's right next to them. This is an extended metaphor for the Toronto Maple Leafs, if you can't tell. And yet, I'm not about to deny Drake agency in this conversation, because for every bleary plea for someone to please take his phone away, there are egregious bars or bad production choices that just shatter any sense of atmosphere. It happens in both White Bone and Fort's Worth, although in the latter is made all the worse with that truly slimy Party Next Door verse. And it's so frustrating because they had tangible potential, I'll give him that. They both remind you of the miasma that Drake himself has created, or producers who are doing him precisely no favors. A long life battle with himself where he sounds like he's losing every step of the way. And for Drake, especially if you've been in and around Toronto and actually grew up in the meantime, it's a story we've heard way too long. The worst R&B fans you know, and my god there's a lot of them in this city, they'll tell you HABIBTI is the best of Drake's triple release. That it speaks deepest to their depicted and oft self-inflicted misery, with cool eyes staring daggers into their face, but no other feature on that face to wrench them free. What struck me is that Drake's fears around generative AI on the closing track show that Heart on My Sleeve may have hit a little too close to home. So he would probably have to do something pretty drastic in order to differentiate himself.
Oh no, you tell me. I feel alive, no thanks to you. What is this I'm waking up to?
I mean, I'm not sure I'd be the sort of person who puts a picture of his own mother on the album that starts off with a song called Ho Phase and later samples Fergalicious. The memes write themselves. I'm almost certain that Drake knows that too, being messy and flagrant's part of the point this time around, because there's been a lot of discussion about Drake's business and record deals, of which I'm certain nobody's got a clear picture. I include Drake himself in that. And there's something that leaps out about MAID of HONOUR beyond the distinctly Canadian spelling of honor. It's how deep down he wants to prove he can make this sound a hit, and probably feels that Honestly Nevermind got a fair shake in the first place. He's wanted to make the globe-trotting, patched-together dance record for years now. I can go back to probably Views that can unironically play at Carnival in multiple latitudes, including Toronto. And make no mistake, if there's something that'll play outside for the casual listener probably this summer, it's gonna be this project. Maybe even more than just this year. Indeed, that's why more critics have actually swung around to modestly support this, where at least he can make them dance and wave their hands. He's gonna be no threat. The seamy blur is the closest to a sprawling DJ set where Drake is more passenger to the production and the guest stars with so many left field swerves, perhaps even more texturally emblematic of Canada's mosaic approach to multiculturalism, with every odd clashing passage that nevertheless forms a whole that might be greater than the sum of its parts. Hell, I can imagine Drake possibly hearing DJ mixes like this in a Toronto nightclub or some international club and loving the vibe. I mean, I've heard them, not always my thing, but I get the appeal. Part of accepting this type of multiculturalism is acknowledging the gaps in that mosaic that might not work for you. And I kind of admire Drake opening up the album with Did You Forget About Back Home, implying this sort of vibe can be found in Canada. You don't have to be taken abroad. And indeed, the internal clash is part of the audacity, tripling down on the ridiculousness for Drake's desperate attempt to win back the female audience at their and his sloppiness. But the thing with the mosaic is that while you can appreciate some inspired flashes or the patterns therein, seeing the seams, at its best it comes together as a whole to support its central idea, central character, and Drake is by far the worst part of this project, especially if you can hear his ulterior motives and the very loose thematic arc of his concern trolling, pushing back on getting married, settling down, moving on, where you can still have this much fun. It's still fun, right? An album I was shockingly reminded of was Tickets to My Downfall by Machine Gun Kelly from 2020, especially by the closer Princess in the worst way possible, where he tries some sort of rock thing, a project that in text and metatext running on thoughts of my career might be ending, might as well swerve, change genres, go out with a bang, but also relies on both a sense of precarity that never quite manifests, and the artist being remotely credible in that lane. And yeah, I'm gonna be that guy. I'd rather hear MGK make plastic pop punk than Drake embarrass himself on the dance floor with some of his worst ever lines and baffling sample choices. And I don't care to indulge any sense of it's so bad it's good ironic appreciation when this entire project will wind up charting and making him money regardless. You can't play the underdog when you're getting 3 simultaneous album bombs, because if I listen to this in context with one of his other albums we're gonna get to, I also don't even think that he ever completely believes he's the underdog. It's also the album where the patois comes back in spades, and where I don't even want to reheat the old bad arguments of a decade ago from those who consider Views a classic album because One Dance went to #1, a song that I've never liked much. So I'm going to make the Toronto specific argument here. Yeah, there is a prominent Jamaican community in this city. I won't even deny Drake might have hung out with them or has the occasional association still, but the solidarity he implies, it's parasocial. It's mercenary, a cheap justification for a new costume that he uses for every new style he adopts. Can you have some self-respect to at least acknowledge this is some sort of embarrassing tourist shit? Either the fans or Drake himself? There's a reason why everyone online started mocking the slurred over Toronto accent that has some real cultural roots, but is now largely adopted by sauceless white dudes who have idolized Drake for years. It's probably ironic this is the album that they're gonna have the most embarrassing thoughts in how Drake prostrates himself in desperation for that summer dance hit. And let's make this clear, there are way too many moments I can't excuse the audacity. It's too embarrassing. Which one was Central C, which was one of the worst hits of last year? BBW for having so much ass you should be cremated line against the oily bass that admittedly goes hard in the final minute. That Hurricane Katrina line against the patois of New Bestie. So many of the painfully revealing and ugly questions of Q&A that doesn't remotely fit in with the New Jack Swing following on Stuck. Man, I wish Drake just committed to the goofy flair that song could have had. Goose in the Juice tries to follow through as he tries to lure this girl away from her encroaching nuttules, but just has me convinced The Weeknd could have pulled it off way better. Then Stunna Sandy is doing her dead-eyed Ice Spice impression on this incredibly drab production. The fuzzed out guitars, gurgling bass, and contorted Kanye West-esque auto-tune crooning on the closer Princess, and it doesn't remotely fit with anything else on the album. And of course, absolutely everything about the brittle clicking of cheetah print where Sexy Red flips the goddamn cha-cha slide. You can convincingly make the argument that HABIBTI sold its existential emptiness. But Maid of Honor feels like just as much of a hollow-eyed midlife crisis album. And while I'll admit some of the production just might not be for me, it'll have cultural resonance with others, it's worth asking why Drake is afforded the biggest piece of the mosaic. Why even as passenger in his arc, he's given the most attention. Unfortunately, I think we all know why.
Manish on the beat, shebang. All of my ops say dead. Why do they gas me up? Where does it go? My head.
So, I don't really want to admit this. I think a lot of Canadians don't. But the reputation that we have as being nice is a bit of a misnomer. And it's always kind of been like that if you know. I've never really liked the moniker anyway because there's a very real difference between being nice, polite, saying the right words, putting on a smile, always preemptively providing the apology, and being kind, showing generosity, compassion. And I'd argue that below the facade of niceness is a certain passive aggressiveness that you really can't overlook once you see it. And when you don't have the outlets of hockey violence or road rage on the 401 or DVP, when you feel like you've been slighted, fairly or otherwise, you often see more glancing blows than the direct punch. So let's make this uncomfortably clear. Drake was always going to have that clenched teeth, I'm not mad forced expression for the rap album, where he has to do whatever he can to reestablish his credibility when the culture and many of its gatekeepers tossed him out. And if you find that patently insincere, petty, bitter, profoundly disingenuous, when you've been one of the most recognizable icons of mainstream Canadian music and you're still trying to play hero and villain depending on the project, really depending on the song, no longer innocent, but not as guilty as prescribed. Not only is this unsurprising, I'd argue it feels authentic in a twisted way that some of us don't want to acknowledge. But just because it comes from authentic emotions doesn't mean that it's actually authentic in execution, or when you give it any thought, it's easy to enjoy. Mostly because ICEMAN demands the sort of active cognitive dissonance to reconcile a fight lost 2 years ago with a follow-through that maybe could have worked, provided you forgot everything that actually happened the past 2 years. I don't know, maybe it was a mistake to get to this album last, following two very different shades of existential crisis, but those were successful in putting the bar somewhere in the 9th circle of hell. But as the production and phoned-in guest features blur past, a pretty major problem with ICEMAN is how indistinct many of the songs seem to be in their bleeping melodies or hooks, or even quotable lines, with the frequent beat switches rarely helping the best moments stand out. And I can't say Future or 21 really put in a lot of effort. I did find moments that I liked. I like National Treasure, or at least the first half of it's got some pretty solid bars. And while I think the Bay flow of Too Hard for the Radio was a bit ridiculous, the leap straight into a West Coast knock for the second half is a rare case where you can plainly tell Drake's actually having fun in that groove in the studio. Probably more fun than the majority of Maid of Honor. I thought Make Them Remember could have been great in some of the shots at both Kendrick Lamar and Joe Budden if he didn't stop midway through the song to complain about the Billboard number numbers that have often been best in his favor, and I nearly had an aneurysm. Hell, I mostly like the whole Make Them series of songs, and the haunted dreariness of Make Them Know absolutely reflects the dread that lurks behind all three projects on whatever comes next. And the opener, Make Them Cry, comes close to setting the stage for a more reflective Drake, where he has that fear of unpacking his trauma, either through psychedelics or therapy. Ironically, if I'm making that Sopranos reference, this is when Dr. Melfi would have cut him off. For good reason. Now call that a finale vibe. Because let's be honest, most of what I'm writing here is familiar. It's easy lyrical analysis done by those who will meticulously catalog every moment of the beef, where the jabs on Janice Shut the Fuck Up, Burning Bridges, Firm Friends, and especially Shebang, they can be quickly and easily thrown right back in his face, especially with all of the lawsuits against his label and how he goes at his competition through their partners. To ask is that two-pronged question, the follow-up. Why do this? And why do we tolerate it? This is a thornier conversation than many want to admit within Canada, because who is captured within that tolerance window is multifaceted. I know folks in Toronto, including myself, who were sick of Drake's antics around the city going back about a decade. I mean, if you pay attention to the charts, Canada has quietly been less gracious to Drake the past couple of years compared to the United States, but I also know we're not the majority in the city. We can be loud and we know Drake's listening, which means a little something different when you're outside in parts of the city. But did it move the needle until Kendrick Lamar said everything we did? And even then, Kendrick often did so by doubling down on the Canadian side of the jab in the biggest hits. He's always been willing to drape himself in the US flag, ironically or otherwise, if we saw the Super Bowl. And on some level, when you've got enough power, that distinction between irony or otherwise stops mattering. This got even more obnoxious as a baseball fan during the World Series last year, where the Los Angeles Dodgers narrowly beat the Toronto Blue Jays in one of the best finals in the sport's recent memory, of which a not significant faction of the fans online tried to use it as proxy for the rap beef the year earlier, and where I really wish Drake hadn't doubled down with the baseball lines on Make Them Remember. And I can't even blame those fans in the United States, given how much Drake has tried to enmesh himself within Toronto sports, and how much the teams have embraced him. Up until the point he gets a little too involved with some personnel negotiations, where diehard Toronto fans will just bet against what he is for. It's so frustrating, because it's not like a lot of those American fans are making the distinction between Drake and the rest of us. And Canadian teams, they don't help matters. A lot of the rhetoric around a whole nation behind you will get appropriated by those when it's convenient in order to amplify the star power. And let's go all the way there. Canada could not have made Drake the megastar he is on our own. I bet there are as many Drake fans in the United States as there are people in Canada, to say nothing of his biggest boosters and industry connections. I mean, the US absolutely owns a significant subsection of this, and then painting Canada as a homogenous blob who owns him during the fall-off feels a little reductive and cheap, to put it kindly. And you know what? We're already there. Let's get political. I will not make the assertion that Canadian culture is devoid of its toxic or manosphere or even fasci elements. They're absolutely a thing across many a province. And if you look up more than a few influencers in this scene, you'll find that Canada is not sending their best. See one Tom McDonald if we just want to keep it in this genre of music. But I'm not going to make the false equivalency of ignoring Scale and the current POS in chief down south, alongside his cadre of fash-adjacent oligarchs who are currently financing tactics to attempt to break Canada apart through dubious Albertan referendums. I mean, the province is quite oil rich. Can you guess their motive here? And where I've also done my best to hold my tongue around some of those half-trolling words of annexation and 51st state by those who are too stupid down south to understand the consequences of that tough talk. It's also why I hated that Drake called the album Iceman, where I don't think he was oblivious to what ISIS connotations are in the United States right now, so much as an expression of power in not caring, thinking he's too big for it, or willing to acknowledge the implications of still complaining the system's advantaging you enough when you're at the top of the pyramid anyway. It's also why I don't give him grace with the politics on this album. After taking cheap pot shots at J. Cole for stepping aside, You try to shoot at DJ Khaled for not saying free Palestine and make them pay, but you co-sign Aiden Ross, which is particularly gross because you burn the bridge with the outspoken defender of Palestine in the Weekend in this city, a local rift you apparently refuse to mend. The crypto cosigns, where even aside the gambling streams, you're still riding for FTX in 2026, all the while ignoring how many of the boosters in that scene who have pivoted to generative AI that scares you so much. The Manosphere bullshit, where the examples across these three projects are too numerous to even count. If this is representative of Canada, we sure as shit are not sending our best. But the reality of it might be worse. Analogous to Morgan Wallen astride mainstream country. He is a figurehead with outsized industrial power over the scene, oft indicative of his worst impulses, but with generally enough deniability to avoid that much accountability for it, and who will be perceived by the far less informed of representative of it. It's why I hated that video with Drake wearing the fur coat with the prominent Canadian brands on it. Not just because of the cheap Canada-specific reference to this country just being a combination of a few telecoms, grocery chains, and banks, which might be perversely accurate for the outsized power they have in this country. To the less informed, Drake is just as much of a Canadian cultural signifier, far more than Justin Bieber, or Nickelback in the 2000s, or Shania, Celine Dion, and Alanis Morissette in the 90s. It might be fundamental realpolitik weakness of the mosaic, that form of multiculturalism asserting national identity, because the rare person who can suck up enough in the room, amass enough outsized cultural power from the nation, but claim to be representative of it, so that it is measured beyond a scale your nation can control. In a conversation of spheres of influence, do you prop up the tree that's too big to fall because you know it'll tear through coming down? It's made all the worse because Drake accumulated his power by borrowing from so many other scenes and people. Let's call it colonization, where he clearly hasn't shied away from that implication, especially as he has to feel like they let them do it. That Farrakhan reference on Whisper My Name feels very revealing in the worst ways possible, the distraction, where he then doubles down by talking about him taking chains from those in Virginia because he's not done shooting at Pharrell. But in a scene that is all about raw power, why would he starve his own appetites? Especially if the scene is bent over backwards to give him more of the power, reinforce the established hierarchy. Maybe it's the reason he sounds so embittered to then get rejected now by those opposite with the same brand of hypocrisy in plain sight. Is it just him that you don't want? And not for nothing, I think they're in the right for saying that, yeah, you might be right, you might have a point, you might have power back home, but we built you first, we don't like you here now. Looks like a lot of folks back home don't like you either. Sucks to suck. This is realpolitik after all. Morality or accusations of hypocrisy, they're on any level, they're out the window. And while Drake has his ties, legal or otherwise, the failure of ICEMAN is refusing to acknowledge the realpolitik. Live or grow in the loss or grind it out to beat them at their own game. He says on Firm Friends he could have posted receipts. But if you're embracing your villain mode and trying to excise yourself from the industry, what are you even waiting for? He surrendered his integrity a long time ago. A lot of us know that. Now he's paying the price for it. Yet he's too beholden to his desire to be loved to be truly ruthless. So the whole release has this desperate, clenched, I'm not mad, you're mad vibe that not only refuses to reflect growth, but also won't go full offense either. He's always been better on offense than defense, which is why the weird cowardice to push back on the White House's appropriation of this album rollout and brand is even uglier. They won't treat you with the respect you crave. Thus, you get all the insouciant whinging about the industry not pushing the buttons in your favor, where the hubris and fear go hand in hand. And it's ultimately why the vision I had of Drake having any sort of forward-thinking comeback was fundamentally local, reconciling with old demons. Probably more mature, albeit smaller, and better for it. Instead, ICEMAN is frozen, static. The backlash then cascades backwards for everyone for which he's set that standard. It's going to perform well, and maybe that's his goal, but at what cost, longer term, and where I circle back to the question of why we tolerate it. A lot of casual fans will flip to whatever entertains them the most. When they prove worthy of being held to a standard, I'll hold them to it. But for every local personality who hype this, Every brand that linked themselves to that fur coat, someone had to sign off. To every Canadian dude or self-prescribed hip-hop head who only listens to Rap Caviar and then tries to push for an Iceman summer in mid-May, when you all know deep down Drake's made better music, you can do better, where I'll give you the grace of assuming you're smart enough to recognize the implications by association. Is that worth it? Because you know there's an example of when you choose to draw the line. When the power was diminished and you felt you could. Let's talk about that one. Yeah, I'm going here. And let's be brutally honest, the majority of y'all didn't even know this remix album existed, built atop their largely forgotten and timid for the worst possible reasons 2025 album Pink Elephant. I did not review that for a lot of very good reasons. It's comfortably the worst entry in Arcade Fire's mediocre at best 2010s to 2020s output, which should not be controversial to say, as I think the rest of the world has finally caught up to me when I said Reflector wasn't that good in 2013, but Pink Elephant's one of the worst albums of 2025, and when you pair it with Win Butler's self-pitying mewling and truly awful songwriting that at best feels like a plea for mercy and understanding, but at worst only grazes in the wake of all the sexual allegations that should have easily put the end to him in Arcade Fire, why even bother to mention it here? Well, for one, the remixes somewhat solve the biggest issue with Pink Elephant, that being there are no vocals on this whatsoever, likely difficult given the divorce of Win Butler and Regine Chassagne, even if they both are apparently still in the band together. So yeah, this goes pure ambient, pure drone, stepping away from the mawkish lyrical questions of sincerity that made the last album so easy to despise. They also left behind the veteran producer Daniel Lanois to keep everything in-house, to sit purely in the wells of analog synth with faint hints of sputtering, gurgling fuzz, and the occasional cycling guitar at the edges to accentuate the gnawing questions, choosing instead to try and lean on pure atmospheric emotional response, which can feel like yearning of this fragmented plea. And at one's darkest, I can imagine how this could evoke feelings of curdled remorse, the crushing waves of animosity that feel implacable and even deserved, an uncomfortable murk awash in yawning negative space where you feel like there's no easy way out. All which I would find easier to tolerate or explain, but this is when I tell you it's a Record Store Day exclusive, the sort of promotion you basically tie yourself to because there was no way in hell anyone else would buy this, especially as Pink Elephant was by far the band's worst performing album. Yeah, there's a mercenary cynicism here that I can't escape. Just because you remove your bad response to the questions doesn't mean they don't still linger. You don't rebuild mutual trust by stepping out halfway. The reason I'm including this watery wisp of a remix album isn't just because I needed an easier target than multiple Drake albums, though that certainly helps, but it's as evidence that in an even more insular space like the Canadian or Quebecois music industry, bad actors, they linger for far too long. When gatekeepers fail, especially when they made legit classics beforehand, as they now cloak themselves in dubiously earnest pretenses and try to write their way out, so long as there's a little bit more money to be wrung out on the other side. We as Canadians have to own that. I got no problems opening up my heart. Nobody should be dying for this. Unless by suicide. I'll leave that as the implication.
Her mother's feet never left the ground. Never dared to leave that little town. That's why she ain't afraid of looking down. But I bet it gets lonely up in the clouds.
Yeah, that's a dark note. Let's try to lighten the mood a little bit, and here's something that's actually a bit embarrassing on my part. I didn't remember Tenille Townes was Canadian until I checked through my notes of the albums that I had covered this past year in some form, only to discover she's from rural Alberta. Grand Prairie, to be specific. It's northwest of Edmonton, a town you can tell is so proud of their semi-famous daughter. And for an album that is entirely self-produced, just her and the acoustic guitar all by herself, but with a few assists from Laurie McKenna and I'm with her in order to flesh out some of the vocal harmonies, years after parting ways from Sony Music Nashville, who never quite knew what to do with her, it has the feel of coming home a bit smaller, being on the lonely road for a long time, making the most of what you have amidst wide open spaces. You feel the negative space across the acrobat, where the title track highlights the legacy of women who are constantly bending for the world that will never do the same for them, and man, as the artist that goes to Nashville and has to come home hat in hand, it's got a sting. But there's the gentle overdubs and backing vocals. The album sounds more communal even in that space, but also an exhale that comes with being a little older and wiser and being comfortable with it. What's meant for you won't leave you behind, knowing where to draw that line. Yet where more empathy might just be what we all need. We could all use a little more love around here. It's why the aged muscle memory that can conjure dreams amidst decades of mundanity if she plays the piano is so heartbreaking. It's why the flickers of friendships rekindled or lost on Grey Like Emmylou is so winsome. And it's also why the ending in Love with the Sky, where she knows her eyes are still on the horizon and she might not ever fully settle down in that small town, it's so striking. So small town Canada, but also universal to any kid who grew up in such a place where you know they could go further. They've got that talent. Her dreams can be comfortable and smaller back home, but never quite fulfilled. And the refusal to compromise. The Birds Still in Love with the Sky feels both sad and inspiring. Knowing you can always come home, they'll always love you, though her art can coax out those feelings, and they aren't even lies that she's drawn back there, but she loves more than just that. Where the acrobat hasn't quite quit the circus just yet, although maybe she's looking for a different ringmaster. How about ending on a high? Especially for those indie rock fans. Happy y'all stuck around. Because while Metric has also run comfortably for over 20 years, they're a band you either like or you don't care that much about, and even in the latter case, you probably still will crack a smile hearing the hits that kicked ass from the 2000s and wondering what they're up to. And then you discover that they put out a new album this year and think that's pretty damn neat. You might even check it out if a friend of yours is a music critic and a longtime fan who just so happens to tell you the album is pretty damn great. And can you tell I'm speaking from a real-life anecdote with one of my friends who are offline? Believe it or not, as much as streaming algorithms try to feed people more of what they want for that discoverability and then place the hand on the scale every so often, said algorithms tend to be pretty bad with the bands who you might remember from your past, but you don't specifically seek out. They don't surface in the same way, especially if the band is largely independent, or they haven't gone viral recently, or you're less online, especially in more localized markets that would keep bands like Metric afloat, even if you would argue they've been playing to formula the past couple of albums and don't have anything close to the pop crossover bangers that gave them legit hits 20 years ago. But Canadian rock radio, they still kind of play them. There is institutional support and that matters. And if that was enough to get you to seek out Romanticize The Dive, yeah, you're gonna have a good, if not great, time with this. Part of this comes with the reunion of the veteran Canadian rock producer Gavin Brown, and the album initially has the feel and thematic focus of literally going back to basics that work in comparison with the more adventurous, if scattered, Formentura albums. Probably for the best, I'd reckon, Metric's rock-solid fundamentals have such a high floor that the weirder electronic pop experiments aren't always as thought-provoking as to stick the landing long term. So if you want the gleaming fat analog synths, the coursing bass, the waves of twinkling guitar until the gallops crash in, the occasional hollowed out post-punk glitter of a song like Crush Forever slammed alongside pop structures that reflect the reality that a band like Metric with the right label support could have easily crossed over more. Tremolo's damn near the heaviest Midnight's era Taylor Swift song. I mean that as a compliment, especially with Emily Haynes' sardonic edge balanced out with genuine yearning at the forefront, and that's before you tack on the harmonic overdubs. Well, you're gonna get exactly all of that. It's familiar, for better or for worse. Normally the latter whenever the underpowered drum machines show up. This album is not perfect. And thus, if you think that Metric swinging around to make a self-serving victory lap at this stage of their career isn't that interesting, down to including the credits of who helped the last time, it tends to be the project made when a band realizes they might be out of things to say and are ready to play the nostalgia circuit, see 2023 Fall Out Boy. But Emily Haynes has always been a smarter and more self-aware writer than that, with a sort of dry and wry humor looking at the cheap luck of their success, and when they used to have a more ferocious edge with rueful but wiser eyes. Less with reproach or nostalgia so much as acknowledging the extremes of both, and that so much of the same spirit hasn't faded just because some aren't paying attention anymore, and they got to adjust to that tough reality. They may have played it loud to fight it at first, but now they can play it a bit quieter and mostly be okay. Clouds to Break makes it very clear it's not easy, but enough of you were along for the way anyway. Canada absolutely has their nostalgic stalwarts who might be well past their prime that they support because they're hometown heroes, where they might even have more runway because we need to support a Canadian talent. The Metric aren't so much that as the old friend at the karaoke bar who always shows up even when you don't. You do 3 shots with you and then knocks a song that they made their own out of the park. That doesn't feel like a fundamentally Canadian experience, but it is a resonant one that can feel Canadian. That collective solidarity. To not be that cheap nor cynical. And that's not always the easiest thing to do, especially as a creator. Because while I've highlighted a lot of fascinating art within Canada across many a genre, there are unique challenges. On pure market economics, it can feel like you're working uphill against volumes and numbers that can undercut you. And if you play capitalist games against global conglomerates backed up by neoconservative deregulation down south, the players with the most capital, they're the ones who tend to keep on winning. And it goes deeper than that, because when you have the winners who beat the odds, do they stay? What stops them from playing the rigged game and sucking the air out of the room for everyone else back home, using the same exploitative tactics? Or becoming defined from without by the low information consumers and bad actors around them, which can leave the mosaic closer to pieces in a kaleidoscope, occasionally beautiful but turned by those around it, constantly tumbling in the wake, rarely forming a clear image. And I gotta acknowledge I'm as much of a part of the hand turning that kaleidoscope as anyone. I might have highlighted a diverse swath of Canadian acts here. I try to be representative across genre and province and nationality, but there are pieces left out subject to my own biases. Just the fact I'm focusing on this year. I know for a fact that if another person did this sort of broad Canadian music montage and analysis, they might have some overlap with me, if only focusing on 2026, but they paint their own mosaic. And there's no guarantee we draw the same conclusions, make the same observations or structural critique, although I think there's a lot of common ground to be found. Even then, while I think there is some depth in posing the conversation, I also know I'm painting with a broad brush. And to what end? To try and ascertain a nationalistic question of identity where I was dubious of the whole endeavor the last time I tried thinking on this at length, nearly 9 years ago during Canada's 150th anniversary, where in consideration of a more thorough and complex version of history, you surrender a more simplistic element of nationalistic pride, that single-minded focus. I mean, emotionally it becomes harder to untangle. By definition, it feels more diffuse. In that video, I tried to get folks to think on what nationalism means, with an informed lens of history that goes beyond the easy branding or cultural signifiers of what makes someone Canadian, What makes someone American or any other nationality? What makes us think, but also what makes us feel? And I circle back to that mosaic in comparison with the melting pot. The latter can be more effective in provoking that defined nationalistic fervor, but it also smears over what it doesn't blend. Maybe a little bit more heat will render the stragglers down, leave the frog boiling a bit longer. And in the service of the American dream, where to paraphrase Innuendo Studios yet again, anyone can make it does not mean everyone can. Not everyone beats the odds. That's how odds work. And as any professional gambler knows, in 2026, they're going to kick you off the apps if you're the wrong person and you are too good. At a time, it might have been effective in what it was selling. But ask any young person trying to live right now across these United States and see how good that melted gruel tastes. Assuming you can afford even that. Canada is not immune to many of the systemic problems down south. Still a capitalist economy here. I don't want to present the false reality that we are, especially as there are plenty of people who want to believe that, or want us to be a lot closer to what's sold down south so that their piece of the pie can be made to feel a little bigger at the expense of others. But call it an overextended metaphor from grade school social studies, the mosaic has more resonance beyond the obvious each piece can maintain identity but builds to a composite whole. It is the acknowledgement that tension, separation, complexity must exist. It engages with the historical reality that creates that real world, then asks the follow-up question of what we can still build regardless. And it is, fundamentally, a symbol that's derived of art. Composite, somewhat abstracted. Some people won't get it, but like all art, its appeal is fundamentally emotional, within the glue being, well, the flawed systems that need to be patched together and fixed to make it look its best. And art is fundamentally the medium of conversation between artist and audience, where we build community at our best and disregard that value at our worst and at our peril. It's not always a linear or satisfying conversation, but we can learn. We can find more by having it. And if that's what Canada and Canadian music can be, what social scene can be rebuilt and remembered, what story its art can tell, at least for now, maybe for a longer time, I think it's a story worth telling. Let's not be cheap or cynical.